director of class is not here this week. He's in New York City. So I'm Rebecca Tarlow, the graduate director of class right now, and also an associate professor in Latin American Studies in the School of Education. And it is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Jennifer Tucker, who is an associate professor of community and regional planning at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Tucker received her PhD at UC Berkeley in regional planning and also has a master's of public policy from the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley and an MA in international area studies also from UC Berkeley. Clearly, Dr. Tucker must have loved Berkeley, but we won't hold that against her. Dr. Tucker's research is about some of the most important topics of the day, including racial capitalism, urban inequality, social movements and democratic practice, and anti-racist education. In this research, she asks, how is urban inequality reproduced? How are inequalities normalized? And how do marginalized communities contest these injustices? This research is directly related to and inspired by Dr. Tucker's own political organizing, which ranges from labor struggles to police abolitionist efforts to Palestinian liberation, all connected to her belief that ordinary people have the capacity to transform their own lives. Today, Dr. Tucker is going to tell us about the Paraguayan city of Ciudad del Este, a town bordering Brazil and Argentina, where one of the largest waterfalls in the world, the Falls de Iguazu, is located. Now, I'm not sure if Jen will remember the story, but I actually visited Ciudad del Este once in 2005. Do you remember this? Mm-hmm. During my junior year in college, when I was in Brazil studying abroad. And I was in the Ciudad del Este for less than 6 hours. My friend Bella and I had just spent 5 days in Buenos Aires, and we were headed back to our university in Sao Paulo. But we decided to take the long route through Ciudad del Este to see the waterfalls. So after a rushed visit to the falls, we headed to the bus station. And like all college students do, we tried to find the cheapest tickets possible to get back to Sao Paulo. And boy, was that a mistake. We bought the very cheapest tickets, and then 10 hours into our 15-hour bus ride, we were stopped indefinitely by the Brazilian police, who held us in custody for hours. Because, as it turned out, the bottom of our bus was carrying thousands of dollars of contraband from China via Paraguay. And part of what Dr. Tucker is going to share with us today is the story of that contraband, which in 2005 was a nuance for me and my friend Bella, but what has been referred to as the largest illicit economy in the hemisphere. Importantly, Dr. Tucker's book, Outlaw Capital, humanizes the people who participate in what she refers to as this popular economy, while also explaining why this contraband is not an aberration of global capitalism, but rather a central part of its functioning. Furthermore, Dr. Tucker shows in this book that these illegal economies are not a product of a weak or absent state, as is the usual explanation, but rather a very specific type of state presence. So thank you, Jen, for being with us here today. We are so excited to hear what you're going to share with us. I only wish that I had read this book 20 years ago before I got on that bus.
Well, nice to see you all. Thank you so much, Rebecca Tarlow and the Center for Latin America Studies Director, Dr. Oyas, for this invitation to present my research today. And thank you to the center staff, Samantha and Elizabeth and Joaquim, for the essential behind the scenes work that make this talk happen. And thank you for being here. It's really an honor. So here it goes. So my research centers on economic justice and unequal cities. My book argues that outlaw economies and the spaces they produce are integral to global capitalism. Further, I show how racialized narratives of economic legitimacy across scales hide the centrality of the transgressive in global capitalism. I ground this analysis in what one journalist called the largest illicit economy in the continent, in the tri-border region of South America, where Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina meet. Ciudad del Este, Paraguay is the heart of the border trade, where traders import and then re-export commodities worth several billions of dollars a year, connecting Chinese export processing factories with consumers across South America. Here, thousands of poor Paraguayan vendors and small-scale Brazilian traders called sacoleros mix with businessmen from places like Lebanon and Seoul. Together, they move an astounding volume of consumer goods, everything from cell phones to whiskey, providing cheap transit to Asian manufactured goods and invisible subsidies to Brazilian consumers. Over a fast 50 years, the city transformed from a tiny frontier outpost into a global trading hub, as central to globalization as New York or London. While central, the city is stigmatized as lawless. This graphic novel, for instance, narrates the city as a den of criminality, while the US Trade Representative names Ciudad del Este as a notorious market, listed for selling counterfeit goods like CDs or cell phones, which they argue produce significant economic harms to US interests. Yet this stigmatized city is also central. Tens of thousands of poor street vendors and traders depend on the border economy. Ciudad del Este exemplifies globalization from below because ordinary workers and not just transnational corporations benefit from global trade. Mainstream analyses decry so-called black markets as corrupt violations of the supposedly separate spheres of legal and illegal economies, understood to be attributable to corruption, state failure, or underdevelopment. More critical approaches assess how state projects differentially aid and abet illegalities. Yet both sides of this debate largely overlook the geographies and urban forms of extra-legal economies. My research intervenes here, showing how global capitalism depends on cities like Ciudad del Este, while this transgressive trade economy produces its own kind of space. Despite the city's centrality, Ciudad del Este is cut out of most stories of development and capitalist change. The stakes of this research exceed these South American borderlands. The return of Trump's white supremacist project to remake the state into an engine of oligarchic enrichment works through deal-making and rule-breaking, key technologies of outlaw capital, the core concept of my book. In many places, outlaw capital undermines democratic practice. Today, I'm going to present a slice of my recent book focusing on the making of Ciudad del Este as a gray space of transgressive profitability. And then I'll end by speculating about what this peripheral city might elucidate about the workings of power at the heart of empire in our present conjuncture, including the intertwining of outlaw capital with illiberal forms of statecraft. Before I get into the empirical story, I'll start with a few words about my concept of outlaw capital. Outlaw economies are central to global capitalism and contribute a significant share of global economic activity. This assertion is almost banal as outlaw economies grab headlines, populate film storylines, and garner the attention of academics from disciplines like anthropology, criminology, and sociology. Indeed, more than a decade ago, the anthropologist Carolyn Nordstrom coined the term ill/legal to describe the interpenetration of illegality and rule breaking throughout a social field of legitimated economic practice. Yet there is relatively little research on the modes of spatial production that enable outlaw economies. Outlaw capital is a mode of accumulation that works through deal making and rule breaking. Conceptually, it's a form of capital that negotiates profits and distributes rents through deals, bribes, and schemes. In contrast to theories of corruption, rent-seeking, or crony capitalism, my frame insists that outlaw capital is an expression, not a distortion of global capitalism. Of course, appropriation and dispossession have always been core logics of capital. Capitalism continues to renew its conditions of possibility by capturing or colonizing hitherto uncommodified spheres of life, from stealing indigenous land to commodifying clean air through carbon markets. These enclosures are an ongoing process rather than a founding moment. Unlike what Marx called the silent compulsion of wage exploitation, to which many of us consent, these enclosures often involve violence and coercion. According to David Harvey, these processes of what he calls accumulation by dispossession, rather than value creation, are the dominant form of accumulation under late capitalism, a seismic reframing of Marxism's historic focus on production and labor, narrowly defined. With the term accumulation by extra economic means, Jim Glassman expands this, including both enclosures and accumulation through social reproduction, which refers to unwaged or undercompensated care work. These extra economic processes are internal to capitalism, but outside the wage relation, a key distinction given the decline of waged work and production as capitalism's central pivots. Outlaw capital is a mode of accumulation by extra economic means. Rather than enclosing and easily identifiable commons, what I call accumulation by transgressions captures or redistributes revenue streams through illegalities. Of course, capitalists break the law often, but with outlaw capital, transgression creates the conditions of profitability. And the concept can direct our attention to the various powers and political implications of this form of accumulation. In particular, the transgressive nature of outlaw capital's profitability means that its advocates must seek ways to hide and to obscure it. This book shows how racial and spatial strategies are at work here. Theories of racial capitalism from the Black radical tradition explain the tight articulation between capitalism and racial domination. From its origins, capitalism tends to, quote, differentiate, to exaggerate regional subcultural differences into racial ones, as Cedric Robinson has argued. Capitalism requires and produces stark life-taking inequalities, for it is moving through these hierarchies of difference that capital accumulates. As Jody Melamed explains, quote, racism enshrines the inequalities that capitalism requires. Racial capitalism also queries how domains thought to be outside of capitalism are in fact internal. So slavery and its sustaining racial hierarchies are understood to be constitutive instead of external or secondary dynamics. Likewise, I argue that outlaw capital's transgressive transactions are internal to global capitalism. While Ciudad del Este is cast out of most stories of global capitalist change, it is, in fact, materially quite central, moving billions in commodities. In Ciudad del Este, the border economy grew up alongside the city as an entangled mix of legal trade and smuggling, both promoted by an urban growth coalition I call the Merchant Bloc. Traders profit through arbitrage, that is, taking advantage of price differentials between different markets. Different sources generate these price differentials, and the legal and extra-legal intertwine. The Paraguayan state created a low-tax environment to promote the legal re-exportations of goods through Paraguay. Contrabandistas, in contrast, evade tariffs and taxes, profiting by breaking the law. Sometimes the state backs extra-legal trade. Customs agents systematically ignore the official tariff classification process, instead clearing cargo planes of high-value merchandise by weight and pocketing the money they divert from state coffers, a process called undervaluation. In the city's vibrant street market, vendors and shop owners rarely charge sales tax, leading to the misnomer that Ciudad del Este is the world's largest duty-free zone. At the same time, state policies promote legal re-exportation. Since the 1990s, registered re-exportation moved goods worth between $1 to $5 billion annually. Proximity to Brazilian markets is a sort of spatially fixed asset. During the 1960s, Brazil protected nascent industry with import substitution industrialization, that is, high tariffs on imported goods. While ISI was ill-suited to Paraguay's small domestic market, Brazil's high tariff created arbitrage possibilities. Traders import goods to Paraguay under relatively low tariffs, smuggled or transported them into Brazil, where they resold the goods at a higher price. City planners long articulated this location as a competitive edge, quote, a magnificent geographical location, and, quote, accumulated experience as a commercial center that yields comparative advantages, according to a 1997 planning document. These trade geographies shift constantly. In the 1950s and 60s, Lebanese traders set up shops that became cornerstone businesses, importing name brand goods from Miami through Panama's free trade zone in Colón or Paraguay's custom warehouse in the port of Paranaguá, Brazil. Brazilian buyers purchased for themselves or for resale. Alfredo Stroessner inaugurated Paraguay's tradition of state-sanctioned smuggling, even calling it the price of peace, because he gained allies by allocating contraband routes to potential rivals. Contrabandistas smuggled luxury goods like perfume, whiskey, and cigarettes, helping middle-class Brazilians perform their class status. The fall of Stroessner in 1989 threw into question the centralized control of contraband as the merchant bloc fought for control over the border trade. About this time, Taiwanese and Chinese migrants began sourcing goods from China, from China's emerging export processing zones. Today, the criminalization of the Sacolero circuit has rerouted many goods directly from China to provisioning centers in Sao Paulo, cutting out Ciudad del Este and threatening the city's economic base. Throughout, the state backed re-exportation and contraband as a strategy of development, even as some sectors opposed the border trade. When changing conditions threatened the trade economy, state policies continued to back re-exportation. For instance, in the 2000s, the regional customs union Mercosur sought to liberalize trade within the bloc, threatening to extinguish the price differentials behind re-exportation. State authorities extracted concessions in international negotiations to protect arbitrage. These deal-making networks protect their profits. An ex-finance minister explained to me how customs agents resisted reform by reducing tax revenues to the national treasury, wryly observing, quote, immediately, whenever there is an effort to reform customs personnel, revenue collections fall. While I don't have the time to tell the full story today, the merchant bloc also fought to decouple local government from national oversight. And for decades, they were successful, even creating a shadow institution to evade constitutionally required audits of Ciudad del Este's municipal books. In 2003, a powerful mayor, Javier Zacarias, convinced a judge to forbid the national comptroller from evaluating the municipality's books, instead establishing a parallel governmental body, the Tribunal de Cuentas. The Tribunal de Cuentas evaluated the municipality's findings in closed-doors proceedings, producing a single sheet of paper approving or rejecting the municipal filing. More than a decade later, this sheet announcing approved by the Tribunal de Cuentas flashed on a screen in a municipal lobby where I waited for an interview. This shadow institution enabled a kind of plausible deniability, especially useful as transparency activists brought multiple legal and legislative challenges seeking to pry open municipal accounts and substantiate their suspicions that the Zacarias administration was diverting public funds to private pockets, what they called caja dos, cash register number 2. Undervaluation and state-supported smuggling are examples of accumulation by transgression, that is, deal-making practices that capture value. Such high-end profiteering practices are enabled by the systemic imbrication of public and private actors, of state and economic capacities. Often these illegalities are talked about as corruption, a language indexing the dominant mental mapping of separate political and economic spheres we inherit from Eurocentric state theory. This misinformed mapping is backed by an anti-corruption industry reliant on the disciplinary assumptions of economics and, as Janine Waddell has shown, ignoring other social science research. These theories of corruption overlook the legalized forms of taking, dispossession, and exploitation at capitalism's core. Their predictable imaginative geography locates corruption in the global south, whitewashing the extensive role of corporate power, private interests, and dark money in the global north. Their individualistic remedies seek to punish bad actors rather than rework systems. Instead of separate spheres, thinking with Outlaw Capital helps focus attention on specific profiteering practices and points us to more rigorous ways of analyzing the relationships between the political and the economic. One model of this thinking is Joshua Barakan's argument that corporate economic and state power are, quote, ontologically linked, doubled, conjoined, but also in conflict. Instead of corruption, I argue Outlaw Capital better assesses the folding together of political and economic powers in accumulation by transgression. Like all economies, Outlaw Capital requires supportive spatial forms. I argue the city and the trade circuit co-constituted each other, as Ciudad del Este grew up alongside contraband. In this section, I consider two urban forms, the port and the mall, detailing their roles in border commerce, their interconnections, and the spatial imaginations that split them apart. In the book, I also consider streets and vendor stalls. Since the mid-2000s, the merchant bloc has promoted shopping mall development along the Paraná riverfront. This started in 2006 with the controversial construction of Shopping del Este on a contested land parcel called the 9 hectares, promised to street vendors. Within the next decade, 2 more malls would spring up. While Shopping del Este looks legal, developers broke multiple rules, laws, and codes to build malls on the 9 hectares, a story I don't have time to tell today. Even further, clandestine ports moved some of the goods purchased in malls like Shopping del Este's. Rumors described full-service transportation logistics for Brazilian buyers, in which businesses arranged for taxi drivers to transport merchandise to the clandestine ports, traffickers to ferry it across the river, and Brazilian workers to deliver packages the next morning to hotel rooms in Foz do Iguaçu. A powerful spatial imagination distinguishes these malls from clandestine ports and vendor stalls, affiliating malls with progress and situating vendor stalls and clandestine ports as problems. Yet these forms are intertwined. Even further, the spatial form of the mall conceals the very social processes of extra legality that create and sustain it. The mall is a cornerstone of global urbanism, a hegemonic form of depoliticized, market-oriented urban development. In part, the shopping malls pretend what David Harvey calls a spatial fix, a means to capture value in the built environment and provide an outlet for profitable investment. While street vendors emphasize the use value of space, that is, the value they get from being able to use street space to sell and earn el pan de cada día, their daily bread, malls are about maximizing exchange value, or how space is valued by the market. Indeed, as Arlene Davila has shown, in Latin America, the mall is a, quote, settling institution. Like plantations, they are tools for regaining control of space and profit, a means to link land holding to transnational capital circuits and generate revenue streams for landowners. Malls share a homogenizing aesthetics of consumption that repeat across a range of urban contexts, luring place-specific signifiers, such that Margaret Crawford calls malls fantasy machines. Shopping malls also index widely held aspirations to participate in global modernity through consumption. By signifying globalized modernity, the mall can stand in for formalization. Across Latin America, planners have come to imagine the mall as, quote, an effective solution to the problem of informality, as Arlene Davila shows, because they mobilize the look of legality. Thus, malls are talismans and fetishes invested with powers to promote economic development, provide jobs, offer privatized community space, and push cities in the global south toward a Eurocentric modernity. While malls are materially connected to smuggling circuits, their symbolic resonances successfully mask these interconnections. In Ciudad del Este, the merchant bloc uses the mall to make an aesthetic claim to legality and formality. In addition to this aesthetic alibi, I show in the book that the promise of the mall rests on how it displaces the street livelihoods of the poor. Clandestine ports are another key space of trade. Hundreds of unauthorized ports dot both sides of the Paraná River and upstream Itaipu Lake, both on the Paraguayan and Brazilian side. Defying our expectations of what globalized spaces look like, these unassuming patches of riverbank process millions of dollars worth of inventory without cranes or container ships. Clandestine ports represent a transformation in contraband logistics. After the city's founding in 1954, traders relied on small planes and private landing strips, transporting luxury goods like whiskey from Miami. In the 1950s, Highway 2 and the International Friendship Bridge transformed the material basis of the border trade, and soon the bridge became the central trade artery. These transport infrastructures unexpectedly decentralized access to smuggling for ordinary Paraguayans and Brazilians to join in. After 9/11, border security took on new regional importance, which drove another round of transformation. Brazil, backed by the US, criminalized the popular secular circuit and tightened its borders. In response, traders turned to the river, clearing patches of riverbank for makeshift landing zones. Former President Horacio Cartes also relies on clandestine ports to transport cigarettes produced in his frontier factories. His factories produce 20 billion cigarettes yearly, 2% of which are smoked by Paraguayans. Networks running through clandestine ports help flood regional markets with his contraband cigarettes. Massive tax evasion reduces the cost of Cartes's cigarettes, such that rule breaking is the source of his profit, that is, Outlaw Capital. Cartes's disavows connections to contraband by hiding behind a complex division of labor that concentrates risks onto specialized traffickers called cigarreros, the ones of the cigarettes. He says, quote, "Contraband is a customs problem. We don't do any contraband. We have a totally clean conscience." The brazenness of Cartes's transgression alongside his claim to a clean conscience suggests a deep-seated sense of entitlement to profit outside the law. The transgression inherent to Outlaw Capital's profitability means that its advocates must seek ways to hide and obscure it. Two local terms name these hiding strategies, blindaje and blancamiento. Residents use blindaje to describe arrangements between judges and politicians promising impunity for kickbacks. Blindaje is a military term for protective screen. Its double sense connotes both protection and an impediment to visibility. Blindaje helps explain the practices of power that protect the ports from oversight. For instance, between 2013 and 2018, there were 0 enforcement operations in the port zone, protecting the smuggling networks that moved Cartes's cigarettes and other goods. These political pacts for protection outlived Cartes's presidential term, surviving even contentious power struggles within the long-dominant Colorado Party. Blindaje also zones clandestine ports as off-limits to certain kinds of publics, including journalists and foreign researchers. Chatting with a taxi driver about a riverfront neighborhood hosting the ports, he commented to me casually, "Oh, you can't go there." He emphasized the "you," suggesting that the spatial restriction was not universal, but rather connected to me and, I suspect, my embodied outsiderness. This small act of blindaje helped produce a conditional map of no-go zones. Likewise, a journalist recounted covering an enforcement operation at a port. As his car wound down the dirt road, residents gathered to block his path, brandishing sticks and yelling, "Leave us poor people alone." This small uprising defended the popular extra-legal economy, yet these port workers and contraband runners are also enrolled in blindaje, protecting the spaces of smuggling that generate fortunes for rich men. We can see here how blindaje is also a spatial practice. Paraguayans use the term blancamiento, or whitening, to speak of political moves to whitewash the crimes of the powerful. Cartes, for instance, served jail time for currency fraud, but then had his record expunged by the Supreme Court. His rap sheet is long and includes contraband, currency fraud, and money laundering. Blancamiento names how wealth and whiteness serve to enact impunity and hide connections to Outlaw Capital. The social standing of men like Cartes buttress their claims to legitimacy. They occupy positions of power and are favorably assessed in media outlets like Forbes and The Economist. Successful performances of legitimacy are unsurprisingly worked out through social hierarchies of race, class, and gender. Blancamiento names the discursive practices that legitimate illegalities because the bodies of these businessmen, by a skin tone, dress, comportment, and the like, index the common sense category of entrepreneur more than that of the racialized criminal. Scholarship on blancamiento has described Latin American state practice of whitening the body politics through eugenics, mestizaje, class-based aesthetics, and immigration policies favoring Europeans. My theorization of blancamiento is related but distinct. I define blancamiento as a set of discourses that legitimate ill-gotten wealth based on proximity to whiteness. It draws from critical race theorists who insist that whiteness is not only a privileged identity, but rather a system of power relations. Legal scholar Cheryl Harris traces whiteness as a form of property, while George Lipsitz calls it a racial cartel that hoards resources while masquerading behind mythologies of personal responsibility, meritocracy, and legal doctrines of color blindness. These approaches help us make sense of whiteness as practices of power, animated by a sense of entitlement to own, to take, to exclude, and dispossess. Whiteness is thus an unselfconscious taking rendered as the natural order of things. Marita Blancamiento through critical race theory then emphasizes whiteness as a racial cartel protecting transgressive forms of property. Despite persistent imaginations which depict orderly northern cities and unruly informal southern ones, Outlaw Capital is not restricted to the global south. I suggest Outlaw Capital can be translated here to analyze the racialized politics of elite illegalities and deal-making in our present conjuncture. Indeed, our conjuncture demands a more thorough investigations of elite illegalities, both as practices of power and as a mode of accumulation, rejecting techno-feudalist assertions that we have somehow entered a new post-capitalist era. As we learned from Edward Said, translating theory is a worldly and intellectual practice, contending with how ideas move, how ideas articulate with power, history, place, and difference as they move. Here I translate Outlaw Capital, a concept generated from a city that Trump might describe as a shithole, to exploit dynamics at play in the heart of empire. My meso-categories of techniques of accumulation by transgression, blindaje, and blancamiento offer important tools to think about the transgressive nature of Trumpism. Certainly, bold-faced illegalities are a signature Trumpist move, intensifying an old authoritarian playbook. Trumpism heralds the expansion of deal-making and accumulation by transgression, although not as a corruption of capitalism, but as an accentuation of practices that have long been central. Trump is the preeminent man of the deal. Indeed, the Chicago Tribune declares that Trump is a deal maker, quote, the way that lions are carnivores and water is wet. He took this prowess to the White House. Railing against the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 2018, Trump demanded the right to bribe, insisting businessmen should be able to, quote, do what they have to do without oversight from a, quote, policeman state. Also in 2018, the New York Times documented rampant tax evasion and fraud in the Trump empire. Trump's father, Fred, a New York real estate mogul and racist landlord, built with Federal Housing Administration subsidies while enforcing the color line. He amassed billions, largely through property markets. As Fred Trump aged, the Trump family and their enablers crafted 295 streams of income designed to dodge gift and estate taxes, funneling over $1 billion to the next generation. The schemes avoided an estimated $497 million in taxes, paying about 5% rather than the 55% rate on inheritance and gifts. One suspect tax scheme of dozens involved over-invoicing. The Trumps established All County, a property management company that overcharged the elder Trump for maintenance and repairs to the tune of 20 to 100%. This freed up a stream of revenue that the Trump children captured, channeling tax avoiding money across the generations. Intriguingly, this is the mirror image of undervaluation in Ciudad del Este, where customs agents undervalued cargo planes full of high-value merchandise by clearing them by weight to redirect a revenue stream from state coffers into their pockets. More recently, New York prosecutors won a landmark fraud case against Trump for slippery accounting practices, which inflated property values to secure loans, but deflated them to reduce taxes. The prosecutorial team estimated these practices generated over $360 million in illegal profits. Trump framed these techniques as standard, if aggressive, practices of valuation, commenting in 2007 that, quote, everybody inflates property values, saying further, quote, who wouldn't? While upholding the conviction, a New York appeals court voided Judge Engoron's $364 million penalty as excessive. The Trump organization thus used slippery valuation as a technique of accumulation by transgression. It hid this with various practices of blindaje, like misleading or fraudulent business records, concealment or disregard, a quote from the court filings, for generally accepted accounting principles of valuation, and legal strategies to block or delay prosecution. Trump's discursive justifications of blancamiento normalized fraud as standard business practice while framing property valuation as subjective calculations inflated by the power of his brand. He also sought to delegitimate the fraud case by framing himself as a victim of a political and racist attack, while deploying his own racist attacks against Black lawyers. Sometimes these attacks are direct, like when he slandered Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg as a, quote, Soros-backed animal. Other times he inserts dog whistles, for instance, referring to New York Attorney General Letitia James as a, quote, racist AG Letitia Peekaboo James, rhyming with a racial slur but denying the association. Trump aimed to discredit the case against him by undercutting Black political power itself as biased and illegitimate. Thus, Trump mobilizes a powerful common sense which discerns the fuzzy boundary between entrepreneur and criminal with racialized assessments of legitimacy. By avoiding the penalty, the appeals court signals the US legal system's inability or unwillingness to hold outlaw capitalists to account, enrolling the courts in whitening their crimes. In 1987, the New York Times endorsed Donald Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, writing, "It makes one believe for a moment in the American dream again," thereby hinting at an affiliation between Trumpism and the US economic project that pivoted on deal making. What is the value regime of the deal? Jody Bird and co-authors identify, quote, the overriding importance of rationalities of abstraction and commensurability for capitalism, in which the property form, abstract labor, and commodification render commensurate or the same an irreducible diversity of life activities in order to make things exchangeable. The value regime of the deal works differently, using personalized relationships, not abstraction, to create asymmetries instead of commensurability. And to do this, to redirect revenue streams and negotiate shares of the spoils. Like contraband, real estate is a personalized game of handshakes, deals, speculative profits, initiation rites and ceremonies, as the researcher Weber has said, rooted in rent seeking. The innovation of Trumpism may be extending these real estate dynamics to the entire economy. Outlaw Capital insists that concepts generated from Ciudad del Este can help us analyze power and profit making in the heart of empire. Reading Ciudad del Este as productive of global capitalism and an important site for building theory flattens colonial hierarchies, which relegate cities in the global south to history's, quote, waiting room, as Chakrabarty has said. Instead, I argue the contradictions of extralegality in colonial racial capitalism are especially visible in Ciudad del Este and may foreshadow the generalization of these dynamics around the globe and into the global north. Yes, the everyday practices of undervaluation in Paraguay's border trade, all counties over invoicing, and Trump's fraudulent real estate valuations are distinct. Yet, Outlaw Capital's mid-level categories, that is, techniques of accumulation by transgression, hiding strategies or blindaje, and the justificatory discourses or blancamiento can move. While participant observation with outlaw capitalists is unlikely, we can still bring ethnographic attention to the everyday, to build more to the everyday practices of these illegalities, to build more robust accountings of the logics, practices, and politics of outlaw capital in other places. As rising authoritarianisms rework white supremacy into campaigns of oligarchic enrichment, the racialized politics of impunity and ill-gotten wealth are becoming ever more central. I hope Outlaw Capital is taken up, stretched, and challenged to contend with these dynamics. So in conclusion, I offer Outlaw Capital as a strategic frame through which to analyze extra-legal economies. Outlaw Capital is a mode of accumulation that works through deal-making and rule-breaking. Uninvested in producing surplus value, it is a form of capital that negotiates profits and distributes rents through deals, bribes, and schemes. By staking a claim to the category of capital, I contend Outlaw Capital is central, not an exotic aberration, not mere empirical variation, and not a stage of underdevelopment to be overcome through the expansion of real capitalism. This is not a new binary differentiating transgressive from clean capital, but rather to emphasize the transformations of capital through different forms as it circulates through different moments in economic circuits. I also argue that outlaw capital is a mode of spatial production. Contraband urbanism describes the spatial forms of a city built for global circuits of extralegal trade. Malls, the signature forms of the so-called formal city and spaces symbolizing modernity, can be enrolled in contraband urbanism. Just as frontier malls depend on clandestine ports, signature spaces of globalization like special economic zones use zones of transgression like Ciudad del Este. Furthermore, racism helps hide outlaw capital. Blancamiento names the political pacts for protection that confer impunity on elites based on class position and proximity to whiteness. As used by Paraguayans, it offers a subversive perspective on illegalities, naming them as the norm and as constitutive of state power. Yet the Blancamiento critique often identifies illegalities as individual moral failings rather than the social relations of racial capitalism, in which whiteness as property includes forms of accumulation by transgression. Extending Blancamiento then emphasizes whiteness as a racial cartel that protects transgressive forms of property. It matters that we make theory from places like Ciudad del Este. From here, we can construct a more complete story of global capitalist change, including the historical processes that have made Ciudad del Este into a zone of transgression. Global capital produces similar places and border zones around the world. And so Ciudad del Este is not an exceptional space, but rather a distillation of the ways that accumulation by transgression is central to late capitalism. Theorizing with outlaw capital underscores that liberal bureaucratic capitalism is one form of many and perhaps an exceptional and waning one. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Look forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Amazing talk. So if Dr. was here, he would say that we always start with the student question. So Dr. Tucker got a bunch of the questions from the master students, but sometimes it's nice to hear your own voices. So I don't know if
Yeah, I'd love to hear.
when it's say out loud one of your questions, and then you can just moderate.
Yeah, happy to.
You all wrote them down.
Yeah.
Hi,
Hi.
thank you so much for your lecture.
Yeah.
I wonder if you might return to this argument against zero profits. I was surprised at your disagreement, given that
Yeah.
one of the central arguments in techno-feudalism is that expropriation at present is driven by extra legal coercive means, right? Not just in the cloud, in the market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the core disagreement is that Varoufakis is arguing that this means that we've gone beyond capitalism and now we're in something new, right? He calls it techno-feudalism. He's looking at these hierarchical exploitative relationships between what he calls our tech overlords and kind of the rest of us, and the way that platform capitalism is oriented around extracting value from us. And the empirical cases are pretty different, right? Like this is a trade economy that actually is around circulating consumer goods, and he's looking at kind of cloud-based capital. And I agree that we are in a period in which capitalism is more oriented around extracting or capturing rather than producing value, and to do it through like a range of techniques. So I think the way that how he points that out is really helpful. And I think my core argument is just that this is part and parcel of capitalism. It's not a new
Yeah.
It's not a new order, yeah.
Questions? Any of the students have questions? I'm planning to take one of your questions that you got from the students.
Sure. Let's see. Okay, this says, you mentioned how outlaw economies are extremely hard to study, in part given the nature of everyday legalities. But I would imagine it's also very risky. What were some of the risks you faced when conducting this ethnographic research? So I have maybe a few comments on that. But the first thing is I felt very safe in Ciudad del Este. And I was most interested in this disjuncture, or I was very interested in this disjuncture between the reputation of the city and the experience of being in the city, which it's a Latin American city. There's wealth inequality. There is some level of petty crime, etc. But I felt safe. I would walk around at night and out by myself and feel okay. And I heard that when my dissertation proposal was being considered by the IRB, that proposal had never raised so many flags as this particular proposal because of the reputation of Ciudad del Este. And I think that disjuncture is actually very productive. And there's a way that the stigmatizing of the city enables academics, policymakers to not pay attention to the way that the city is actually central. So in the book, I look at sort of different narratives that say this is a place of corruption and it's due to a local Paraguayan culture of corruption. And that is kind of the escape route from seeing, oh, it's like this local problem instead of actually a really important site that helps us think about global capitalism. So I actually felt safe. There was some risk. I opened the book with a story about being called into a chamber of commerce where this businessman who's kind of a wheeler and dealer, and he puts on the speakerphone and he makes a call to the municipality and is like, hey, you saw the La Gringa at this occupation where the street vendors were trying to claim this land of the 9 hectares. And so I'm present as these two men are sort of discussing my presence in the city. And that was definitely a message to me to kind of telegraph, like, hey, we know what you're doing. But I think I was protected by whiteness, the US passport, being perceived as legitimate, also sort of protected because people didn't take me that seriously as a young person who reads as a woman. So I think maybe that's what I'll say about that question. Yeah.
I just want to follow up. First, thank you. It's an amazing presentation. But could you share, maybe in a nutshell, how you navigate the IRB flags? I think the students might be interested in hearing that.
What is there to say about? So I was able to get an exempt. And so I had to work to kind of figure out the right language, right? You need to kind of translate it in. So the IRB emerged to evaluate ethics in the physical sciences, right? In health studies. So it's not actually always a great fit for the kinds of work that we're doing in ethnographic research. So I think the biggest tip was I just had to make a case that signed consent forms didn't make sense in that context. It's kind of unimaginable to be me and as a American white woman going around asking people to sign papers before they talk to me. Like that just wasn't going to work. So I did get exempt, and I don't know if I have tips beyond that. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk.
Yeah.
I have a kind of a question, hoping that you can maybe expand on a little bit. The first is just I understood that the transgression, accumulation, or transgression.
Yeah.
I know TA, but I forgot the other word. But it's about deal-making practices capture value.
Yeah.
And you gave a lot of examples, like among like the elite
Yeah.
people, but I was wondering if like you could maybe talk a little bit more about like the street vendors and how maybe that is it applicable to the street vendors and like the way that they're engaging? And in chapter 1, you kind of talk a little bit about like the knowledge of the street vendors as a way to maybe start thinking about more ethical economies or like other ways of like
Yeah.
thinking about I guess capitalism. So I'm kind of curious if you could also just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
More.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, there's another version of this talk where I focus more on comparing the illegalities of the elite illegalities and street illegalities. And the arc of the book describes how elite illegalities are protected. They're either allowed to continue even though they remain outside the law, or they're actually brought inside the law. So there's a whole kind of process of formalizing the electronics importing export, where they just cut a bunch of taxes and kind of bring it inside the law, but the practices remain the same, right? There's the circulation of electronics that's moving through the country, but not really contributing to state coffers. So that's the story of the elite practices. And then the story for the street vendors is one of criminalization, because their spatial and economic practices are understood as a problem. And then I learned from street vendors who make a very forceful argument that the context of rule breaking matters. So it matters if you're breaking the rules in order to feed your family, para el pan de cada día, or if you're just doing it to make more money, even though you already have too much. And the imagination that street vendors put forward, I mean, it's important to emphasize that street vendors aren't putting forward an anti-capitalist perspective, right? They want to participate in markets. And where I do think they can help us think about cities differently is that they understand the city very differently. So instead of seeing space as a commodity and valuing it based on what you can get through its exchange value or what it's worth on the market, for street vendors, space is it is valuable because it creates opportunities for livelihood. And so street vendors claim it for its use. So it's for its use value rather than its exchange value. And there was one street vendor who, in a speech trying to reclaim city space after a group of vendors had been evicted, described the city as a olla popular, a collective soup pot. So it was also seen as this collective resource. And another important vendor leader who has unfortunately passed away since I've done this research, he described, the city was often described as the lungs of Paraguay because it brings money from outside the country and gets it into Paraguay. But street vendors conducted their own analysis and their argument was, it's actually street vendors who spend the money in Paraguay. So street vendors take money to their barrios, to their communities, spend it in the despensas and the shops, whereas a lot of the brick and mortar business owners lived in Foz de Iguazu, so they were taking their money outside of the country. I forget if I missed a part of your question.
No, you answered both.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, Nicole.
Going a little further into what you were just talking about, how much of the analysis that you arrived at was held by the street vendors?
Yeah, I try to make that visible in the book, so a lot of the terminology, like blindaje, blanqueamiento, like this is language that Paraguayans are using, and I'm taking their analysis and their critique seriously. And the argument that I make about why it's important to take street vendors' knowledge seriously is they're navigating, right, these extra legalities on a day-to-day basis, and so have important insights in how the city works. And like all knowledge, it's partial, so it's important to not romanticize it, but to understand its limits. And then I think the step that I took is putting it in a particular theoretical tradition and thinking about it in relationship to capitalism. So local Paraguayans had a very astute analysis of the unfairness of the system, which harms poor Paraguayans and protects elites. and sort of see the state as actively involved in producing these differentiated vulnerabilities. And really seeing the state as producing illegalities, not as an arbiter, not as defining or deciding what counts as legal and illegal, but actually the state as productive of illegalities. But they didn't then like take it to the next level and sort of said, this is how global capitalism works. Like that was me. Yeah. Yeah, Kelly.
Thank you so much for this talk. Really fascinating. I really look forward to reading your book. I think it's an apt title, you know, the notion that capitalism is legal and, you know, that illusory boundary between legal and illegality is something that can be historicized. Being a historian,
Right.
you know, when you think about the rise of capitalism, I mean, the notion that it was ever legal is a misnomer. I mean,
Right.
you speak about the British piracy against the Spanish Empire. Spanish Empire itself plundered, you know, the French and the British going after each other as pirates, you know, and the British were some of the first narcotraficantes, the opium wars against the Chinese.
Mhm.
You know, it goes on and on. And I like how you brought in Trump, who's just sort of making, you know, capitalism or whatever, crony capitalism much more open and visible, you know, just through his force of personality and his brand and his style and so forth. I'm not sure if there's really a question I'm getting at. So I'm just kind of making those comments and wondering if there's some of that in the book. I mean, that doesn't have to be. This is not ethnography, obviously, of a particular area, but I couldn't help but see Perfume is Cuba, which is really interesting. Because when you talk about an informal economy, you know, in a black market, that is like such a loaded term when it's applied to socialist economies. You know, like, yes, you know, socialism has failed, you always have this black market and so on and so forth. And here you're showing this is part and parcel of capitalism, right? And I know for a fact that like Mexico's economy is like half informal, you know, what they call the informal economy, right? So I don't know. I mean, do you have any thoughts about sort of the things I brought up? I don't really have a question.
Maybe the question is like the difference between outlaw capital and primitive accumulation, like that moment of like stealing to like generate wealth initially.
Yeah, I had a thought and it just left me. So I think the idea behind the primitive accumulation is an idea from Marx that capitalism actually does require this, and that he sort of thinks as a potential as an initial theft, like the enclosures at this moment of commodification, and where there is open violence in order to create kind of a pot of money that's then used, right? And then other theorists say no, like that's actually kind of ongoing. And I think that process of capitalism going outside of itself and enclosing or taking and then bringing and relying on expropriation or other coercion, that's actually part of global capital. That's part of capitalism. That's part of what keeps it going. And I think the difference between outlaw capital is that this isn't like looking to a sphere that hasn't been commodified yet or something that's kind of outside, but it is playing with these fuzzy boundaries between the legal and illegal and using, you know, it's like Trump's fraud practices, right? It's like all these transgressive transactions that create the conditions of possibility. Oh, the question I wanted, like the history question. So I think it's chapter 2 it is a history of this particular region and is looking at really massive transformations from a plantation economy, essentially the yerbales, and there were peones, essentially slave labor, and then it, you know, transforms into this contraband or this commercial hub. And so there's really massive transformations in the economic form, but the political relationship of schemes, esquemas is another word that I take from Spanish, like, and that describes this tight relationship between public and private actors, or politics and the economy, that is consistent throughout. So that this, like, one continuity is ill-gotten wealth or elites using transgressive practices in order to enrich themselves. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a question from a PhD student
Yeah,
online.
yeah.
And they were wondering, would like to know more about the intersection of outlaw capital with the question of drugs in Latin America.
Mhm.
For example, to what extent is it worth it to think about the problem of drugs as distinct or included in the issue of outlaw capital?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And there are drugs and guns that move across this border, and that felt too risky for me, so I didn't include that. And I think would kind of be an empirical question. I'm thinking of the work of Teo Balve, who looks at narco capital. So he thinks about how the form of capital is different when it works through drug economies, and it is. And it seems like that category is actually maybe more useful than outlaw capital, because what he points to is that there's a qualitative difference in the kinds of profits that are possible within narco economies. It's also dealing with he calls it the blockage of illegality, and then they have to legalize it. So like the moment of legalization is the same, but in this case, I don't know that other thing is the same, which is this qualitatively different amount of profit that is potentially available in drug economies. I think it would be an empirical question. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I had one question. How does a person become a street vendor, and if it is possible to exit to stop being a street vendor? How does it work in terms of the social dynamics?
Yeah. There's a lot in the book about street vending that I didn't get to in this presentation. And the reason that I had access to to street vendors is because I was a Peace Corps volunteer and I was living in a small community, and Ciudad del Este is so important to the country. I didn't really understand it at the time, but kind of everybody has connections to the city. So the Post family that I lived with for a while had 6 family members who were working as street vendors, which is sort of how I got out there. And people access street space in lots of different ways. Sometimes they just grab it. Oftentimes, historically, you would have backing of a politician who would kind of authorize your claim. And I had access to an old census where they indicated authorized or unauthorized, but it wasn't like whether authorized didn't mean you were like compliant with the codes. It means that you had a political backer, essentially, an empowered political backer. And street vending in Ciudad del Este could potentially be a ticket to the middle class. Like the street vendors that I was connected to built homes, sent their kids to private schools. I mean, they worked really hard. They were getting up at 3 and 4 in the morning, 6 days a week in order to be there during the busy times. It's very hierarchical, and there's a spatial and racial differentiation of vending and labor. So indigenous vendors claim space on this, like they'll just spread a blanket, right? And they don't have any fixed claim to space. Or very poor vendors are known as ambulantes, and they don't have a fixed claim to space. They're carrying their goods on their back, and then they're selling them, and they're harassed, and they sometimes are pushed out by more established street vendors who resent the competition. Sometimes they're supported by vendors. It changes. And so then, Paraguayans would have fixed stalls, and sometimes they would have infrastructure. So this is public space that's been claimed as theirs, and people really see it as theirs. Mi puesto, this is my spot, sort of. And it has historically been defended collectively by associations. And that is a complicated story. The extent to which those are independent or kind of enrolled in clientelistic relationships with the municipality. And then there were more foreign-born people who would own brick and mortar businesses. There were some Paraguayans, but mostly it was Lebanese, Chinese, Korean businessmen who had brick and mortar stalls. Yeah.
Jennifer, this is really fascinating.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I was thinking about sort of this preconception that I came into the talk thinking about informal markets as, and I think really advantageous, like liminal spaces for local politicians, maybe, right, where they can extract rent. And you showed the case of the former president sort of like using this illegal market to sort of profit and benefit massively. And so I'm wondering, like, as a political scientist, I have this, you know, like a hunch that like maybe, or the argument that I'm thinking of Alicia Holland's work, talking about like forbearance, that politicians want these legal markets to exist, because then they can sort of like selectively enforce and extract rents and things like that. So when you talked about the malls as like substituting, or I'm not sure if I misunderstood the role that malls played, and sort of maybe just masquerading, but there was still corruption in there, but it kind of takes, it would seem contradictory to what I would expect like, would be like politically advantageous. And so I'm wondering, is it a matter of scale? Because Ciudad del Este like has a kind of national relevance. They can't extract as much rent from illegal workers, from informal merchants as they can from these kind of contractors. Or like, what is special about this case, or how should we think about malls in the sense of like political interest and switching away from
I mean, there's such a rich lineage of scholarship and work on informal markets. And I like to think with the term popular economies, which comes from Latin American theorists who, especially Veronica Gago out of Argentina, who are arguing that these are places, these are spaces that are built from the ground up, and they are oriented towards meeting people's everyday material needs, and that they do have kind of non-normative logics to them. What I really like about the frame of popular economies is it frames it as seeing in popular economies are disputing the distribution of wealth. Like it's poor people being like this, we have access to this, you know, we should have access to this. And that's also an important frame because it's not romanticizing popular economies, it's acknowledging that they are imbricated in and also infused by capitalist logics also. And I think there was some rent extraction, and I can't quantify it in terms of municipal officials like taking bribes from individual vendors to not harass them, basically. And then there was a process of formalizing that, and then vendors would kind of pay an amount to the municipality. I think the relationship between the municipality and the street vendors was more of a political one than an economic one. I don't think they were really extracting that much money, but they were extracting political support. And there was a very intentional, this is what you're getting at, and what Alicia Holland also gets at, is there was a very intentional strategy to keep vendors' claims to space tenuous. So they were politically dependent on the municipality, right? That they would have to vote, that promising, it was kind of a trade for votes for we won't kick you out, right? And then the relationship, the story of the 9 hectares it's kind of a tragic story because the land was expropriated after the fall of Stroessner in '89. It was land that Stroessner had gifted to himself, the interior minister, and the president of Brazil. And then this land was taken and was like, we're going to build a space for street vendors here so they can have a collective space. And then there's a very long history of that contestation, and the malls sort of represented the closure of that vision of that expropriation project actually not in the end benefiting the street vendors. Yeah.
Another question, or one more question. Why don't we just get the 2 questions and move on to that?
I'm just gonna follow up on this past question. Just really asking how outlaw economies and the function that they have for different states shape how those states also enact border policies. Just kind of wanted to hear more about that.
And then wait, grab the second question also.
I'll just give my question. I'll talk to you later.
Oh no, I want to hear the question.
I'll talk to you later. I'll ask you later.
Yeah, so the border is obviously key. And the border is a space where the movement of, that kind of filters the movement of people, right? Even though borders allow easy movement of capital, kind of just to make a big generalization. And you know, the Paraguayan state really wanted to maintain, it's hard to kind of, I feel like having a hard time generalizing because it's like the border politics is really on my mind as we're in a period of the expansion of ICE, and US border politics is really kind of different than the border politics there. So just thinking about those border politics. I don't think I have a good answer to your question, but what's coming to mind is one protest. There's actually a association of caseros, which is basically small scale traffickers. So they were politically organized. They had an association that represented them. They had a lawyer who I interviewed, which was a hilarious interview because he wasn't going to tell me anything because he was representing contrabandistas. But in one of their actions, they were pushing back against the essentially less laxity of goods crossing the border. And then they shut the border down, and then there were individual, just paseros who were deciding kind of who gets to cross and who doesn't get to cross. So it was a very interesting moment in which the border, which is what you think of like the state having control of, ordinary people took control of, and then kind of engaged in these state-like practices of deciding who gets to cross and who doesn't get to cross. So just to emphasize it, the border as a really contested space. And the importance, the livelihood importance of these trans-border economies.
Oh, yeah. Okay, it's good. Well, we want to thank you, and please join me with a clap like we do at the end. Oh, well, thank you. Please join us next week again at 1:30 for our next